Virginia Gov, Youngkin'S Exaggerated Demise. Conservatives should know better. The Washington Post called it a disastrous night. In the 2 weeks since the election, media outlets on the left and right have announced with the glee of children on Christmas morning that Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin had met some terrible political end. Fox News anchors called the losses an epic failure for the governor. Politico screamed, Glenn Youngkin's white knight era is over. Even a week later, the Associated Press exclaimed, GOP election losses in Virginia are likely to quiet the presidential speculation about Governor Youngkin. A Newsweek headline blared, Glenn Youngkin's devastating loss in Virginia sparks wave of jokes, mockery. That's right. Apparently, holding Democrats to razor-thin majorities in the legislature in a state that hasn't voted for a Republican presidential nominee since 2004 is devastating. Even conservative outlets joined in on the epitaph writing, driving the perception that the 2023 election was a total disaster for Virginia Republicans. At a time when Washington politics seems one step removed from pistols at dawn, some history and perspective are instructive to ensure we cultivate higher caliber leadership. Mr. Youngkin's supposed Waterloo resulted in Democrats having just a one-vote majority in each house of the Virginia General Assembly. The GOP missed keeping control of the state Senate by less than 2,000 votes. Republicans won in 13 districts. President Biden won in 2020 and in 7 districts where a congressional Democrat won in 2022. Unlike party leaders who claim they'll strenuously campaign and raise money for candidates, then vanish when the going gets tough, Mr. Youngkin appeared at more than 100 events in the closing months of the campaign. His political action committee raised and spent some $14 million for this year's contests despite the risks. Political pile-ons that are divorced from reality are a disturbing trend in our politics, and conservatives shouldn't play into them. Politics has always involved kicking the other guy when he's down, but the best way to self-destruct as a party is for Republicans to take their lead from the talking heads and social media trolls who dig political graves for officials who are very much alive. Imagine if, when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, his political obituary was written when Republicans lost seats in 1970 and again in 1974. He dealt with Democratic majorities all 8 years he was governor. As California governor, he faced a recall pushed by organized labor, and in 1973, his referendum to make it harder to raise taxes failed at the ballot box. None of it stopped him. As venerable Reagan biographer Craig Shirley is fond of reminding us, before politics, the nation's 40th president made 56 movies in Hollywood. Some were good, and some were terrible. Reagan had grown a thick skin long before his name ever appeared on a ballot. He played the long game. The left in this country has such a shallow bench that it now includes prominent socialists such as Senator Bernie Sanders, has-beens like Hillary Clinton, and Kamala Harris, the most unpopular vice president in history. Gavin Newsom, Democrats' golden boy from the Golden State, presides over the homelessness capital of the nation, from which taxpayers are fleeing at a higher rate than anywhere else. Let them eat their young. Conservatives should know better. No serious observer in the run-up to 1980 said Reagan was unelectable or that his career was over because he lost a few seats in the state legislature years earlier. Nobody credible signaled the end of Reagan because he had to negotiate with Democratic majorities. In fact, the rough and tumble of both Hollywood and California politics likely helped make him the strong leader of the conservative revolution that changed the world. John Sears, Reagan's campaign manager, once said that politics is motion. Ronald Reagan stayed in motion, and my guess is that so will Glenn Youngkin, driving a broadly popular agenda focused on growing the economy, regulatory reform and education, among others. He can stay in motion after he leaves office in January 2026. Reagan gave speeches, wrote columns, and had a radio show, all things that kept him relevant. Will Mr. Youngkin be the next Reagan? Who knows? But at a time when the GOP has lost or underperformed 4 elections in a row, maybe Republicans and conservatives should take a longer view of politics than the trolls on X. So, before you join the chorus of the uninformed talking points crowd, get the facts. Understand the motivations of those behind the hype, chiseling the political headstones. When it comes to Governor Glenn Youngkin, it wasn't a death blow, more like a flesh wound. Virginia Gov, Glenn Youngkin'S Exaggerated Demise. Conservatives should know better. The Washington Post called it a disastrous night. In the 2 weeks since the election, media outlets on the left and right have announced with the glee of children on Christmas morning that Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin had met some terrible political end. Fox News anchors called the losses an epic failure for the governor. Politico Party of losers spices up latest GOP debate. DeSantis-Haley showdown no match for evil genie Ramaswamy. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley would really like to tear each other apart to claim the donor-approved mantle of being, not Donald Trump. But someone keeps getting in the way. You're just scum. Mrs. Haley spat during Wednesday night's debate with unbridled contempt and laser hatred in her eyes. That was after she threatened to use her 5-inch heels as a weapon to physically attack her opponent right there on the stage. Only the opponent she tangled with all night was not Mr. DeSantis. It was the endlessly disruptive and highly entertaining biotech entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy who kept stepping in between Mr. DeSantis and Mrs. Haley to absorb blows and lay down withering fire of his own. In addition to Mr. DeSantis and Mrs. Haley, Mr. Ramaswamy flamed the debate moderators, GOP donors, the Republican National Committee Chairwoman Ronna Romney McDaniel and Canada. "We've become a party of losers," Mr. Ramaswamy declared one day after Republicans somehow managed to defy history and lose ground in Virginia elections during the historically unpopular presidency of Democrat Joe Biden. But when Mrs. Haley and Mr. DeSantis tried squaring off to win control of the GOP like a couple of practiced fencing artists in white suits, Mr. Ramaswamy suddenly appeared like a genie out of a bottle, looking like a cross between Elvis Presley and a vampire. "Do you want a leader from a different generation who's going to put this country first?" the evil genie asked. "Or, do you want Dick Cheney in 3-inch heels? In which case, we've got 2 of them on stage tonight." Mr. DeSantis is famously slow to register human emotion. But he could hardly be blamed for taking a minute to realize that it was not just Mrs. Haley's entrails slopping around the floor of the debate stage after Mr. Ramaswamy's agile knife work. Mr. DeSantis even looked pleased for a half-second before realizing he, too, had been gutted in the exchange. Dick Cheney in 3-inch heels was also a reference to Mr. DeSantis, who has been dogged on the campaign trail for wearing lifted, cowboy boots to make himself appear taller. I know these debates are really supposed to be all about policy and important political positions at a moment when our country is going down the toilet, but it really is hard to concentrate on all that boring stuff when you have a real-life scene right out of Hannibal Lecter where the evil genie is feeding a guy's brain to himself, and the guy is still smiling between bites. Meanwhile, on the front row of the debate hall, top Republican donors looked at each other and nodded vigorously. "That's a great idea. Dick Cheney in 3-inch heels. You think we could get him to come out of retirement, transition to a woman, strap on a pair of high heels and run against Donald Trump?" Now that Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin is out of contention for 2024, GOP donors are willing to try anything. And if anyone in drag could lure them into the LGBTQ tent, it would definitely be Dick Cheney in fishnets and stiletto heels. Meanwhile, Mr. Ramaswamy was not done with all his magic voodoo up on the debate stage. As Mr. DeSantis and Mrs. Haley desperately tried shimmying up the greasy pole to make headlines by attacking each other, the evil genie came in for perhaps the most devastating evisceration of the night. Noting that Mrs. Haley wants to ban the Chinese spyware social media